I'm Frances Corner. I'm head of the London College of Fashion, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to be trying to interview our guest tonight. Okay, so I hope you're going to bear with me. And I'm really so thrilled that so many people have come to listen to this evening, because as I'm sure you're all aware, our guest this evening really is one of the giants from fashion journalism. He's been involved with the industry for over 35 years as a designer, stylist, illustrator, editor, broadcaster, and has really written expertly in a really insightful and thoughtful way about fashion. I mean, Vogue magazine has acknowledged his enormous contribution to the industry, and this is also recognised worldwide. For example, he's creative director at the Audi Fashion Festival in Singapore. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He's a senior fellow at the Royal College of Art, and he has an honorary doctorate here from the University of the Arts, London. I'm sure that you will have all read his books, you will follow his commentary in the newspapers, you will again watch read his blogs and so on, because I think the great thing about him is, again, he's not frightened to say what he thinks. And in the days and times when very often people are, I think we all find that really refreshing. And I'm absolutely delighted that he has agreed to be interviewed here this evening. So let us all welcome our very own Colin McDowell.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Frances, for that very handsome introduction. It's very strange for me to be on this side, because normally I'm the one who's asking all the questions and trying to be difficult and make them sweat a little bit. You know?
Yes, now it's my turn.
But now it's my turn. So, would you like some water?
Yeah, yes, thank you. And I think really what I wanted to do was, and I think one of the things that's so interesting about you, Colin, is the fact that you have had a really interesting journey in terms of how you've got to where you are today. And I think particularly for the students that are here this evening, that is one of the most insightful things about Colin. So obviously born in Northumberland, and you often talk about that as being a key part of who you are. Yeah. But obviously an incredible journey since then. So do you want to sort of say a little bit about how that journey began?
Yes, I would say that my life has been the wanderings of a person who hasn't any idea of what he really wants to do in life. When I was young, I went to university a long time ago. This isn't the hair dye, this is the actual colour it is, unfortunately. A long time ago, when really you went to university just because you wanted to study a particular thing and enjoy a particular discipline. And so it was really it was bad training in this respect, in that I didn't really have any idea at all of what I was going to do when I came out of university. I remember talking to my father on a lovely sunny morning, I remember it so vividly, and he said, well, what are you going to do now? And I said, quite truthfully, I'm going to the south of France for the summer. It's not as grand as it sounds. We went on the sort of airplane that wouldn't even be allowed to get onto the runway, let alone in the air, on student flights. I think it was a way of sort of keeping the unemployment figures down. You know, they hoped that a certain number would drop into the sea. And we stayed in a marvellous little hotel in Nice, which we, romantic as young men often are, we convinced ourselves was a brothel. There was absolutely no sign that we desperately wanted it to be. Anyhow, he said, no, I don't mean that. I said, what? He said, what are you going to do for a job? And this was not entirely a shock. I did know that I would have to earn some money somehow, but it seemed a little sort of sudden when I'd just come down from university. And I said, I'll think about it when I'm in France. And of course I didn't. So I loved my father. We were very different. But when I look back, I realised that I've turned into him, in fact. And he said, right, if you decided what you're going to do, and I said, no, he said, right, go into the army. So that's what I did. And I loved being in the army. I absolutely loved it, because all decisions were made for you. They even told you when you had to change your socks and your underpants. They even checked that they were there in your laundry. And it was like the welfare state gone mad. Yeah. You didn't have to think at all about anything. Of course, that's only when I was an ordinary soldier. When I became an officer, it was even better, because you didn't have to do anything. There were no wars or anything. It was a great life. But I'd always wanted to be, am I talking too much about this?
No, you're okay.
This is my this is my hinterland. You know, and after this you can make up your mind whether you want to leave or whether you want to stay. I had always wanted to be a painter, but again, my mother was very gentle and very unassuming and rather shy woman. My father was the power. And I said to him when I was 18, I want to be an artist. I want to go to an art college. And this caused quite a little upset for quite a few days at home. And he said, no, you go to university, that's what you have to do. So I went to university. I was quite happy to go to university. I read English, which was great. And, you know, it's a very nice way to study, to just get up out of bed and start reading a novel and convince yourself you're actually working, you know. It was ideal for me. But I always thought, well, maybe I could paint. So I went to Italy, to Rome, marvellous. The seminal moments, we all have seminal moments in our lives. Mine were going to university. It was fantastically freeing for me. Then there was going to Rome, and then there was getting into the fashion business. They were the three sort of big steps in either an upward path or a downward path, depending upon how you look at life and where I am now. I'm not quite sure. And of course, I soon discovered my father was right. Why is it that fathers are always right? I couldn't paint for toffee, of course. And so I drifted around in Rome doing nothing very much. And then I got a job in Cinecittà. I had acted when I was at university. I'd acted at the Edinburgh Festival and done various things. And that was great because I was, unfortunately, you earn good money when you're acting, but there are long periods when you have to imagine that I was very, very, very thin in those days. Very, very long and thin, you know. I'm now not just the oldest person in fashion, I think I'm probably the fattest person in fashion. Because, of course, age and fatness are not allowed in fashion, really. I don't know how I get away with it. But anyhow, I was not the sort of person who could pass, no matter how much makeup I had, as an Italian. So I was in great demand for the sort of rather soppy Englishman, typecasting clearly, who cuts up all his spaghetti and then still gets it all down his tie. I worked with I was the straight guy to a marvellous comedian called Alberto Sordi, and anyone who has been in Italy will know he's like sort of Morecambe and Wise, and he was great. The other sort of role I used to get, which I rather enjoyed, was the jackbooted army officer, you know, being incredibly pompous, but pompous in the wrong way, pompous so that people could laugh at me, you know. Anyhow, let's move on to fashion.
Well, that was what I was going to, was in a way how, what was it in Italy? I mean, obviously you worked, you know, in a number of sort of areas with the Italian fashion. You talk about the fact that that was really important to you. About developing your understanding of fashion. So what was it that sort of captured your imagination and meant that fashion was really what you wanted to focus on and in a way draw all of these things together? You know, you're interested in literature, your interest in performance, because obviously fashion has a strong performative element to it.
Absolutely.
So what do you think it was that was pulling these elements together for you?
Well, I think that you look back and you think, where have I been happiest on holidays? And really it was between Paris and Rome. And someone got me a job teaching English as a foreign language, which I hated. So I went to Rome, but then I gave that up and sort of, really in those days, this was the 70s, shows how old I am. And you didn't need much money. I don't know how we did it. You know, I dare say there are young people in London who are having a great time without any money now, you know, but I was interested in, my great passion is architecture and art, and I'd been sort of going and looking at the architecture of Italy even before I went to university, and art as well, of course. Leonardo opening tomorrow, something you all must go to. It's the chance of a lifetime. They'll never have a Leonardo exhibition like this again, so make sure you go. I'm not being paid by the National Gallery for that. I thought it would be nice in the sun and everything. I had very little idea of fashion at that stage. What I loved about, I went, as I think many people do of my generation, I went to Italy with rather a superior view. And I thought, oh, these Italians, they don't do anything. They make ice cream, and that's about as far as it goes. And I was amazed and overcome by the incredible creativity of everybody. Little shopkeepers, the way they did their displays and everything, it was quite amazing. And then I backed into fashion, really, because I could draw. My father said I couldn't be an artist, but I could draw. And I learned everything about fashion with a man who was at that time very famous. He was a couturier called Pino Lancetti, and was considered in those days slightly ahead of Valentino. And Rome, of course, was the centre of couture at that time. So I learnt about fashion through couture, which is a particularly demanding thing, very precise. I didn't, of course, cut. I didn't learn how to cut or sew. I was his assistant, which means I was usually the one at 1 o'clock in the morning feeding the poor house model black coffee and holding her up whilst she was almost fainting with exhaustion, whilst we tried the sleeve in just one more time. Because he used to say to me, Colin, what would Balenciaga do? You know, I met Balenciaga. He was the most terrifying man. Oh, what a terrifying man. So cold, so cold. And I was trembling. And this was in Paris. And I shook his hand and said, good evening, sir, or something. And he said, good evening, monsieur, and just walked away. I was furious. But he'd earned it. Why did he want to talk to a kid? You know, one of the great, well, I think the greatest designer of the 20th century. So I slipped into fashion, and I found that I loved the drama of it all, the excitement, and the thrill of the urgency of it all.
But you also understood it as well because of the discipline of couture.
Yes.
Really is like no other, isn't it?
Yes, and I'd always been terribly interested in the Renaissance painters and the way they painted fabric and how it fell and everything. So I've always been interested in fabric and texture and colour. And then at that time I was living with a girl who was very tough, and she decided she'd come back to London, and so I came back with her. There was a major difference in the way in which we came back. She came back with a nice job already tied up with Marks and Spencer's, I think. I came back with no money and no job, and our relationship didn't go on very much longer because she was a very practical woman. She'd been to, where'd she been to? Kingston Art College. In those days there was a woman called Daphne Brooker who put the fear of God into all her students, and she was very down to earth. Jane also was very down to earth, and it became clear that we could not go on if I couldn't get a job. So I'll tell you, there are two things that have made my career, if that's not too laughable an expression for it. One is the fear of penury. I've always done things but I've suddenly thought, oh, I've got no money left, you know, and also the idea that one can try something new, and if it doesn't work, you can move on to something else, you know. I've always been quite sort of flighty like that.
So, but in a way that's, I mean, the flightiness has allowed you to get this huge range of experience.
Yes.
Which I think is one of the things that so interests me in terms of how you write, because you draw all sorts of comparisons, you reference so many different elements, whether it is painting or literature or architecture, and that allows you to be really insightful. And I think that that's one of the things that really distinguishes you from so many other fashion commentators and journalists. I mean, is that something that when you look back, you can see that you've pulled these elements together, and it's part of how and it's coloured your writing?
Absolutely, I do think that. I also think that until comparatively recently, a lot of the arts all worked together and worked with fashion, and really people looked back to the work of Chanel, Balenciaga, Vionnet or whatever to learn things. Now I think our corporate memory is very short. When I talk to young people, I can tell that they think history is just about when their mothers were born, perhaps. Anything earlier than that, it doesn't matter. And in a sense, I think they're right, because we are a fare-forward culture now. We look forward and we don't look back. And we're also very immediate in what we do. And I think I've now got a head full of learned lumber, which has very little actual practical use, you know. It was fine for me because that was the time that I lived through, but I actually think that For the young, there's not that very much to be taken from the past. Some people might want to argue that later when we have questions. But this is what I think. Like most people who are no longer young, I'm quite confused, really, about just what the young are about, you know, and where they're leading us. Because, of course, they are the leaders now. Of that, there is no question. And in a way, you think we're being led by people who have not got very much experience. But then I felt that I was a leader when I was at university. I knew nothing at all. And I do think it's very important for people of a certain age, that is anyone over 40, to not allow themselves to get into this mindset where you think, in the old days. Because when you say that, what you mean is, in the good old days, when it was better because we understood it. Now, I love it when I live in Soho, so I see extraordinary sights, I can assure you. But I love the fact that I see things and I think, why would they want to do that? And that's the question, really, that we all have to answer, particularly, I think, creative people. Why are they doing this? What do they want me to do? What do I need to give to people so that they are ready for the next stage? And I'll tell you this, creators have a very short life in this respect. Not people like actors, say, who are recreating all the time someone else's words and mise en scène or whatever, but people who are saying, this is the way you should look now. And I think really it is very, very difficult for an older designer to cut it, really, to put it bluntly, except if they become a sort of fantastic figure where there is no question ever to be asked. I think Lagerfeld has reached that point. And so has Armani to an extent. And of course Chanel did. Will the Chanel industry ever die? There are books every 4 or 5 months about Chanel. They all get reviewed, they all get put in the front of the window, and I assume they all sell. You know?
I mean, that's one of the things that obviously you've written some really seminal texts, you know, your Directory of 20th Century Fashion, you know, the Dress to Kill, Designer's Scam, all of those have been really important texts which have helped us look freshly at fashion and some of the key figures within that. As you say, you talk about Chanel, or you're referring to Lagerfeld and so on. What is it that draws you to particular subjects? What is it that you're trying to reveal and expose about creativity and the beauty of fashion, but also the nature of the industry itself?
Well, I have a great respect for creativity, even that which isn't on the highest level, because I have learned the hard way in Rome and in various other points of my life that I am not really a creative person. When I look back to university, if you do English literature, you are trained to be a critic, and critics are rarely creative. So I think that it behoves us all not to laugh. It's very easy to laugh at the new thing and say, what a load of rubbish. When I first saw on the runway these skinny little pants that boys wear now, showing their ankles, and these extraordinary tight little jackets, I thought, oh God, this is ridiculous. No one over 20 could wear them, because I missed the point, as I frequently have, of course. I missed the point. The point was no one over 20 was meant to wear them. And now see every little scallywag in Soho is wearing them, and they look fabulous. Again, when I laugh, what have I done? Something funny?
Okay.
Am I going to blow up?
No, I think you're all right.
I see young women now who really, they don't need to bother to wear a skirt. And it's so short. And when I first saw it, I thought, God almighty, cystitis and all the rest of it. But you can probably hear me without this, can you? Should we try? No? Okay. But what I really think is that we all sit in judgment far too much. And you've got to be a very broad person to be able to sit in judgment without it coming down to either A, I can't wear a skinny jacket, therefore skinny jackets are bad, or B, they never wore skinny jackets like that in my age, therefore they're bad. You know, I think that it's terribly difficult being very young or being very old. It's only in that middle slot between 25 and maybe 35 when you feel you are aware of everything that's happening. Before that, you don't know very much. Although I think young people now are brilliant at hiding their ignorance. Absolutely brilliant. I'll tell you this, I think that young people are fabulously confident in a way we never were. Because all the hierarchies, you know, of respect and everything, which we believed in, which I still do, they don't really matter. You know, and I love the fact that if I'm rarely in London at the weekends, but if I am, and I've been to the theatre or something, and I'm walking back through Soho, and I have to go through a crowd of people, because no one's ever in a pub now. You know, the old days when you couldn't get a seat in a pub, there are plenty of seats in the pub because they're all outside, you know, and I love the fact that I've got to push my way through, and all the time I'm thinking, come on, for Christ's sake, you know, I've deserved the right to have some respect from you. And of course, it's absolute rubbish. I don't believe in respect. I really don't think respect is a very good thing in general. Consideration, yes, and a temperate approach to people, but respect is very dangerous. That is what Gaddafi had. He had craven respect, and we can all see what he's done for the country. But that's going to get political, so let's
but I will ask you about,
quickly go on.
I mean, that's one of the things I did want to ask you. I think that, again, talking about all the references you've had, I mean, we often have these Guardian conversations because we're both avid Guardian readers.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the interesting things about your writings is the fact that it's about the politics, sometimes with the small P as opposed to the large one, but you are all the time making these connections, and you have often talked about how fashion clothes radical ideas. And I think that's what is it about fashion? Is that one of the things that's drawn you into fashion, is the fact that it does give vent to, whether it's youth culture or black power or all of those things?
I think appearance is one of the most powerful weapons we have in the world. And I think that the semiotics of clothing are very interesting. You can tell, really, by looking at a person at 10 yards, what sort of person, in general terms, that person is going to be. That sounds a cliche, but in fact, it is true, in my opinion. You just think, ooh, those shoes? No, I don't think so. No. Like my mother used to say when we used to sort of bring people from university, you know, for a weekend, so she used to say, my mother was a snob, she used to say, will they fit in, darling? You know? And I love the ones who don't fit in, you know, and don't give a damn. I like the idea of having a little frisson of fear when you see a couple of sort of guys. Girls are just... Girls, I can tell you, if you want to check this out, check it out at Soho this weekend. Girls are much more aggressive than men when, as our vicar used to say years ago in Gloucestershire, drink has been taken. When drink has been taken, they become a very, very dangerous animal.
No, I would
agree. Exciting like a tiger.
I mean, obviously, you, one of the
Can
other...
I just say one thing?
Yes,
that I've forgotten to say. The short skirts, the really short ones, which actually I now think look terrific, I think it's so sad that the girls who wear them, they're always are the ones with fabulous legs. Because a girl always knows what her best points are. Boys never have any idea. And they're always pulling them down. And I think that shows a terrible, terrible lack of confidence. If you're going to wear something which is like a pelmet, then wear it with style and panache. And if they see your knickers, does it matter? Or isn't that part of the whole game in any case? I hate it when obviously in fashion we meet a lot of very sophisticated people, marvellous PRs, clever people, and they sit down and they're doing this. And I think, don't do it, honey. You know, just let it all happen. You know, and it's not as if they're naked under it.
No. I mean, one of the things you talk about, actually, you brought up about the difference between men and women, was that for you, obviously, men were often more freer or more able to experiment than women, and women were very much driven by, you know, the designer influence and so on. Do you feel that that's really begun to change? It's much more open now.
I do. Yes, I do. I'm not the best person to say this because I'm quite biased. I'm quite prejudiced. I don't really think men are much good. That's absolutely true. I'm not saying this because the majority of people in this place are women. I think that men are still the timorous sex. We worry so much about what people are going to tell us, think about us, and whether our mates will laugh if we wear a brightly coloured sweater or something. You know, I think it's women. I have had some incredibly influential, very strong women cross my path. I can't think of any men who've had the... For example, I knew Diana Vreeland. Some of you will know who she was. She was the editor-in-chief of American Vogue, and she was a real power. I met her when I was in Rome, and then a few years later, I used to go and see her regularly in New York because I was writing a book on Balenciaga. But I couldn't write it. In fact, I just didn't have any Spanish, and it soon became apparent that if I wanted to talk to all the people who worked for him, I had to have Spanish. And I just thought, you know what, but she was a splendid woman. And she said to me, do you want to hear about this little story? It's not really about fashion, it's about a very powerful woman in fashion. She came and stayed with the woman who I knew in Italy. And because I spoke English, I sort of looked after her. This is how we got to know each other. And on the day that she was leaving, I was sectioned off to make sure she got on the plane and everything. So she had a very fey and very sweet, but incredibly stupid young man sort of looking after, carrying her handbag. And so I went to the hotel, it was the Hassler, I can't remember, and I said, how's the packing going? And he looked as white as devil, wild-eyed, and he said, what you must understand is at this point we are working with a woman who is totally deranged. This is a good start. And I went up, in fact, there she was. She was wearing her standard thing, perfectly cut Yves Saint Laurent pants and a little black silky sort of thing. It was in the summer, and she had a glass of, as I thought, water, but of course it wasn't. It was vodka. And this is one of her major problems. You know, people used to say, oh, she rouges her brow, but in fact it was flushed from the fact that she drank vodka all day. You know? Anyhow, I said, how are things going? I said, there were three little ladies in black busily pressed. Everything had to be ironed before it was put into the trunks, and she travelled with trunks. She must be one of the last people in the world who did that. And I said, is everything all right? And she said, yes, perfectly, why wouldn't it be? And I said, I didn't know you spoke Italian. She said, Italian? Of course I don't speak Italian. And I said, well, you seem to have them doing exactly what you want. You must know some Italian. And she said, I'll tell you. I have learned that you must never speak to these people in their own language because they pretend to misunderstand. This was Diana Vreeland. She was great at cryptic comments like that. Anyway, I'm going to finish this. It's not about anything.
It's all right.
She's all coming back to me now. I got her out to the airport in the afternoon, and we were in the VIP lounge, and her son, who worked in the American embassy, had come, and we were all chatting and everything. And I could see this little guy who run the VIP lounge, looking more and more anxious. And eventually he came up to me and he said, he told me twice before, she must get on the plane now, otherwise we will lose our slot, and Alitalia will have to put all of the first class passengers in a hotel, we won't be able to move until tomorrow, will you please get her onto the aeroplane? So I talked to her son, who I thought was quite frightened of her, and he said, well, I leave that to you. And so I said, Daddy, you really are going to, you have to get on the plane. And she said, very well. Said, I need a wheelchair. So that delayed us even longer. I think she did actually, because I think she'd had quite a lot of vodka. Anyhow, as I was saying goodbye to her, she said, you know, I love you English, you're so polite. She said, but I want to tell you something, young man. They have to get it right, and that means right for me, not for them. And she shoved her head up, she had all these bags of it crashing down. I thought it was sort of Armageddon. And I thought that was the missing link. And I discovered that that's what made fashion work. The monsters, people like Karl Lagerfeld, people who get right to the top, they have this in their DNA. They have to get it right, and that means right for me, not for them. I've never forgotten it was 30 years ago.
It's really interesting because I think that, I mean, obviously you've interviewed some of the great designers of our time.
Yes.
And who within that, I mean, obviously, you've had people like Galliano and all the things that have happened to him, and people will be saying that sort of thing about him. Who are the other people that you feel have been really influential and have changed the way that people perceive what fashion might be about, like Diana Vreeland and Karl Lagerfeld and Chanel and so on?
Well, I think we'd have to put Tom Ford right up there. He had a moment which, when he was at Gucci, which changed everything. I still regret bitterly that he went to Yves Saint Laurent, because he didn't get Yves Saint Laurent, really. I think that people like, I'll tell you, Donna Karan, when she did that fantastic capsule collection, if you remember, and they showed it in the Guildhall or something, that was a real eye-opener. This simple little wardrobe, about 8 pieces or whatever it was, and it was all black. Look at how many women are in black. You know, it wasn't Chanel who invented black. It was Donna Karan, in my opinion. And of course Armani. He was in his heyday. He was great, and so was Calvin Klein. Yeah. Thinking of famous people, I'm going to tell you something which is very funny. I've told lots of people. I was here some time ago, and I think it might have been for Tom, but it was a very grand thing. So I went to have a pee, and I went in, and there was this little Oriental guy doing just the same thing. Now, men will understand this. If you're standing very close together, the silence and the atmosphere when two men are together is frightening. So I said, are you looking forward to it? And his reply was, and it just shows how reputations can be destroyed, he said, I can't believe I'm in a lavatory with Colin McDowell. So I thought, great, let's hope it's not bugged. Anyhow, I think we're very lucky. We've had some fantastic time. Let's not forget Vivienne Westwood. The Earth Mother. They've all, John fed on her, Lee fed on her, they've all fed on her. No doubt about that. And one has to think also of people like, someone like Paul Smith, who isn't a designer, in my opinion, but is a person who gives people what they want.
Yeah.
You know?
I was also interested that, you know, you've talked about people like Claire McCardle, for example.
Yes.
You know, people who, in a way, have been incredibly influential, but who we don't, most people wouldn't know who she was.
Unfortunately.
But, you know, and I think, are there other people that you feel have...
Slipped through the net?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yes, Bonnie Cashin's another one.
Yeah.
She had an enormous influence for a very short period. She did beautiful leathers and had huge influence on both Ralph Lauren and Armani. They stole her ways of fastening things. She was one of the first to use industrial fastenings and the sort of the rough wear, you know, that Ralph Lauren has now made his own, really. Yes, and I think it's interesting that England has not produced many of these seminal figures, and I think it's because basically we are very puritanical, I'll tell you another little story, which was a real eye-opener to me. When I was in Italy, at one point, I was helping an exceedingly sophisticated and elegant Italian PR woman, perfectly dressed. And we had I nearly said the name there, but I'm not kidding. We had a journalist from England who would come out, and we were showing them the collection. Beautiful silk blouses, fabulously subtle, creamy color, just beautiful. And she said, "How much are they?" So we translated it from lira to pounds, and she almost fainted. And she took this terribly moralistic role. Said, "Well, of course, English women would never pay that amount. If that's the price of a washing machine." And my friend said, "Oh, in Italy, we have the blouse and the washing machine." And that seemed to me to sum it all up.
That's probably why they've got so much debt at the moment.
Exactly. But it summed it all up, the idea that you have to do serious things with money. But you're right, of course, that's why it is about to bring the whole of Europe tumbling down our ears.
I mean, obviously you referred to a number of key, of really influential designers and people you think are really important. And obviously you've talked about Diana Vreeland. Are there other commentators or people that you feel have changed how we view fashion? Obviously,
yes.
apart from, who would you say?
Yes, and I'll tell you, this is something we can be proud of. There's a new book just been published on Dazed and Confused, a seminal magazine, and still a strong magazine, which has got the lovely subtitle, Doing It All Wrong, or something, or as it came into mind. It's a fabulous book. And the other person, of course, the real person, isn't Anna Wintour, it's Karine Rottfeld from French Vogue. They've done a book she's done a book called Reminiscences or something, and every page quivers. There are no words, because these are the sort of people who don't care about words, of course, and they're interested in pictures. Every page quivers with excitement, creative excitement. It's a book that I was sent to review, and I think I've reviewed it for somewhere. Anyhow, it's a book that I'll keep going back to because it is just a visual tonic. And I think that, I'll tell you what I think. I think that at one time, fashion was designers. Now I think it's a triumvirate. It's designers, it's stylists, and it's art editors. We get our fashion from the page or from the screen, and it's a creation of stylists and photographers and stylists are incredibly bold. They're much bolder than really they're allowed to be in many magazines. Something like English Vogue, for example. It has a certain parish, and so it can be fun, and it is fun with Mario Testino, or people like that, but it can't be directional. Whereas the ones that are directional are Italian Vogue and French Vogue, which of course have very small circulations. And somehow they get away with it, I don't know. Well, they get away with it because the two editors are hugely respected by designers, so they get lots of advertising. We all know the point of a magazine is not really to inform us, it's to get advertising. And I think that we've got to be proud of people like Katie Grand and various people like that, because they have done extraordinary things. And much of the excitement that comes out of somewhere like Louis Vuitton or Prada is in fact from people like Katie. I remember once, a long time ago, I was waiting in Milan airport, and there were these three very larky girls, and I didn't know who they were. One of them was Katie Graham, and they were getting drunk. The plane, of course, was late because it was Alitalia, and they were getting drunk, and people were looking at them. And an Italian said, "Really, English, they behave so badly. Look at this dreadful girl." And the person I was with said, "What she doesn't know is that those dreadful girls are just going back," it was after a week of collection, just going back, having done an enormous amount to further Italian fashion with their styling. And furthermore, the woman who was saying this was this sort of woman said, "They're worth infinitely more than she will ever And it's probably
very
true.
true.
No, I think that I think it's Katie Grant. She once told me when she was working for Prada, I think she still does. She goes for a month in advance, so she's a really important part of the creative process. Because really, it's only in the last month that they begin to put it all together, and I think we have to take great pride in that. I don't know how you really train a stylist. I think it's a sort of osmotic thing. They take it from clubs and on the street and everything, and they just seem to know. I've seen Katie Grant looking, well, at first glance, terrible. And then just a couple of weeks later, I see somebody else in the same sort of thing, but never with her style. And it just seems so right. Now, that's what I call a fashion leader, you know?
I do.
And I think one of the problems with fashion today, I might move on to one of the problems with fashion today, in fact the world today, is we're living in an excessive society. We have too much fashion. We have too much of everything. And of course, those of you who are old enough to be educated like me, i.e. look back a bit, you cannot fail to be reminded of Versailles. And we all know what happened to Versailles. I think we're in a very dangerous situation, actually. We have half of the world which is absolutely, totally opposed to our morality, our attitudes to sex, our attitudes to women's position, and they are going to, eventually, there's going to be a diaspora. They're going to sweep across, either looking for power or looking for water. Galbraith said 40 years ago, the next real major war would be for water.
Yeah.
It's so obvious that he was very prescient. It's obviously going to be the case. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I do sometimes think when I get a very thick magazine sent me, or a ludicrously overpriced present, bride, you know, they're not saying, oh, you're a lovely man, Colin, so we'll give you this lovely present. I might say that Mrs. Burstein, a figure for whom I have the greatest respect, always gives me a very suitable and sensible present, and that is a few bottles of red wine. And I think, why aren't other people? I have got more Louis Vuitton Prada bags, and they're all in my attic. I know this because I'm moving house in a couple of weeks' time, and there's so much stuff up there. I like to think that no wine, that doesn't go up the attic. I like to think, and I know it's true, that Mrs. Burstein put some thought into what she done. The others just say, oh, Colin, oh, he's not sample size, as indeed he's not. Oh, send him a bag, or send him a belt, you know? And frankly, I'd rather not have anything. You know, it's not thought through at all, so it's not a gift.
I mean, what about the other, obviously, you are hugely committed to all the issues around consumption and excess, and we've talked about this and worked on projects together. But also, I think one of the other things that is really important about what you've done throughout your career is the nurturing and support of new talent. I mean, you have huge commitment to the students, you come in regularly here, you talk in other institutions, you obviously develop Fashion Fringe because of your concern about how we were going to bring on new talent and so on. I mean, what is it that that you recognise, or what is it that you're trying to sort of really nurture and support through that?
Well, there are two things. I think it behoves the old to help the young. Even if the young say, bugger off, we don't want your help. I think you have to offer it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think it is harder and harder in these excessive times to really get somewhere. And I think it's harder and harder to decide what you are, how you're going to help people. I'll tell you what I think. I think it's very dangerous having a good idea. Because if you have a good idea, you tend to think, that box is ticked. The good idea isn't a good idea until you know what the second good idea is going to be, and what the ramifications of the first good idea are going to be. Now, when I set up Fashion Fringe, I think many people here would agree with me, London fashion was in a very powerless state. It was very demoralised. We were losing all our designers. No one quite knew what to do. And I have to say that that has changed totally. Now London is a force, which is why, of course, Milan is being difficult with London, because they can see that there are dangers in what's happened in London. But I do think that it's very important, people who are in authority, that they really know what they're doing and think it through. We have, when I set off Fashion Fringe, no, and people just said, oh, well, they go, you know, what can you do? Well, we've stopped them going, but I think we've created quite a dangerous situation, because we have someone who is an ambassador for young designers. Now, that's fine, but if you're an ambassador, whether you're paid or not paid, you have to find people. And so we now have a vast number of people on the calendar. And a lot of them do not deserve to be there. And a lot of them will not be there if the slump continues, which I personally believe it will. And so that was a good idea, but they didn't think it through to the next stage. I think it's vital. It absolutely, it's a bedrock thing. You cannot leave innocent, hopeful people to the edge of a precipice and then say, sorry, mate, that's all we can do. And I think this is a danger.
I mean, one of the things, obviously, that's particular about London Fashion Week and also London fashion, or the UK understanding of what fashion is very much based around the fact that we do, through, I think, you know, the art school systems, that we've got produce great creativity, great ability to develop new ideas and really push the industry on and so on. But as you say, the price of that sometimes is, how do you keep supporting the designers, and then also what sort of filtering mechanisms can you then begin to develop to then make people understand there are other aspects of the industry, or other industries, creative industries, that they can move into. And that's one of our big challenges at the moment.
The big challenge is to keep them going. A couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago, Susie Makers and I were waiting for a particularly slow show to start, and we started sort of ticking off the number of people who had been a sufficient name to be in a newspaper or a magazine, who have just disappeared, you know, and I really don't think that's good enough. You have to say, right, you're not quite ready, we're going to take not 20 people, we're going to take 5 people and make sure that they stay, you know, and that's the hard part, of course. That is the hard part. I think one of the problems also is that the blurring between high fashion and high street fashion is getting more diffused all the time. You know, unless you really know fabrics and cut and everything, it's very difficult to tell the rip-off from the reality. And I remember, where was it? At Ferragamo or somewhere. They showed me 2 bags, and they said, one was bought in Istanbul, one is ours. Do you know the difference? And I said, I looked at it, and I said, well, frankly, no. And the woman who was in the sales, the woman said, and neither do we. And that is the terrifying thing. Because the standard of ready to wear is so high now. I mean, I'm not necessarily something like Zara, although I have the greatest admiration for Zara. I think they do fabulous things. And they're so quick and sharp. Everyone says, oh, they rip everybody off. Well, everybody rips everybody off in fashion. I think it was Madame Vionnet who said, there have only been 2 original ideas in fashion, and they were both mine. What a fabulous thing to say. She was a tough old thing.
So in a way, what sort of bit of advice would you give to the students of today, both say being a young fashion journalism student and also a young fashion design student? What would the piece of advice be for them?
I think that the thing to do is to make yourself as informed as you can be, talk to people, listen to your tutors. They're in college not because they're stupid, but because they know what they're talking about. Listen to them, and then reject what doesn't fit. We all have to have something to stand on, and it's other people's knowledge. And we either develop that knowledge or we kick it away and stand in our own way. I think that another thing that's forgotten, and I think this is one of our problems, where people come out of college and they're snapped up immediately, the newest thing, blah, blah. It takes a long time to know, and particularly to know yourself. That is why all of the young designers in London, in my opinion, are basically doing the same thing at the moment. And it's so boring. And it's very difficult because they are selling in America at the moment, yes, but they're selling in America for a variety of complex reasons, which we won't go into now. But the fact is that as things get worse, and I don't wish to be depressing, but they are going to get worse, in my opinion, then, of course, the Americans will not buy designer X from here. They will buy Proenza Schura or one of their own. I'll tell you why. This is a very important point. I'll tell you why Italy was so successful with the Made in Italy slogan. Italy, and I know this because I was there when it was developing, Italy aimed itself first and foremost to Italians. Italians buy more Italian labels than they buy anything else. They do buy other labels, of course, probably including English one, but it was this business made in Italy. We are Italians, we are proud, we buy Italian. Now the problem here, we go back to the puritanical thing, and the blouse versus, or shirt versus the washing machine, is this. We do not have a fashion-conscious society. And I don't know why, because for centuries we were the leaders of style, and visual style as well. But you know, you can go down to Bari or some tiny little town, and you can guarantee, even down in southern Italy, you will find at least 2 shops full of designer labels. And they've been going for years because people buy them. Go down to Exeter and try to buy a design label. Go up to Hull and see how many, how much choice you'll have, how many Lagerfelds you will see up there. And I don't know why it is. I don't know why it is, except I think we are deeply puritanical.
Do you think also the whole, I mean, it's curious, isn't it? We are deeply puritanical, but we've had this sort of mania for consuming, which I think has been one of the problems for fashion, is that it's just buying stuff as opposed to buying fashion. Yeah. Do you feel that there are real opportunities at the moment? Yes, there's the recession. Yes, there are concerns about resource depletion and so on. Do you think that fashion has an opportunity? I mean, it is the great driver in so many ways. It does reinvent itself and so on.
I believe that fashion is the lingua franca of the world now. Everything is sold through fashion, by which I mean fashionable attitudes as well as anything else. I think fashion is a cultural force that is here to stay. Whether it gets better or worse really depends upon the young people in this audience. At the moment, we're just about holding it, I think. But then what do I know? I'm dressed like my father would have been dressed. Which of course is what men actually like. They like to be dressed like their father. Makes them feel safe. Anyhow.
Okay. And what I'd like to do is to invite, you know, so many of you here this evening to again ask Colin some questions. I've got a couple of other things I might want to return to later, but please, questions from you, because I know that you'd be very happy to answer. Manny.
No.
Talking about various people and events that affected the industry, had a major impact. You didn't mention the Carnaby Street's 1960s. How important do you, if at all, did you think that was?
Oh, I think it was very important. I think it was very, very important because it sanctified what youth wanted to do. I live just off Carnaby, and it's so terrible now. It's just cheap jeans all the way down. When you think of what it was before, it was really, I wasn't living in London, I used to come up, and it was like going to the circus or something, you know. Yes, certainly, and of course, Mary Quant also, Ossie Clark, they were all important, because they gave the young a sense of style which wasn't the style their mothers and fathers had, it was their own style. In fact, they said so clearly, without actually putting it on a notice board, parents keep out. And that's a very good start for a new movement, whether it's fashion or whatever. That sort of excitement was because they weren't entirely motivated by money. It was the excitement of doing their own thing and defying their elders and betters, as it were. Now, of course, everything is immediately turned to money. If you can't make money out of it, then what's the point of doing it? And I think that's the Versailles sort of scene.
Other questions? Yes.
You talked about fashion being very excessive nowadays. Do you think that maybe we're moving too fast and we're losing things?
Well, I don't know that we're moving too fast, but I think, you know, when you go to the collections, there are so many fabulous ideas, and they just sort of disappear, you know, and they come back a little later. But I always think a second time round is weaker than the first time. So I do think that we, you know, we throw ideas and attitudes and approaches away. It is, of course, because we are now in a culture where we feel everything can be instantly refurbished, as it were. You know, we're sick of this, we've had it for 2 months. But maybe, there'll be something else. Maybe that is the way fashion should be. You know, I'm very doubtful about whether there's any, why the fashion, I think the fashion business is really rather old-fashioned. And I wonder why people aren't saying, look, we've got to find a more sensible way of showing clothes than the huge jamborees twice a year, which cost so much money and cost quite a bit from the point of view, ecological point of view of the world, with airplanes and everything. No one seems to be able to quite have got it yet, how we can show clothes in an exciting way, get them to the people who want to see them and everything, without this huge sort of carnival, as I say, twice a year.
And what about the role of the sort of new media, new technologies, the social media?
Well,
how is that influencing it and changing it?
I'm sure you can realise this, I'm not a geek. I wish I were, because I think that there are so many fantastic possibilities, and people who are in a position to perhaps activate them are a little wary of them, because they're not quite sure what they're going to unleash. But of course, Kindles and iPods and pads and all the rest of it, they are clearly leading to something very exciting. Every time I sit at my laptop, I think, if I live for just another 10 years, I will laugh at how primitive this machine is, how stupidly it will not do what I want it to do. I have a very intellectual nephew who says, it does what you tell it to do. Your trouble is you don't know the difference between button A and button B. I frequently phone him and say, Tim, it won't do it, it won't. He says, what was the last thing you did? Because I'd never know. I said, well, I pressed it. Which button? You know, and it infuriates me because I would love to engage with all of this new technology, because this is where the real excitement is.
And what about the influence? Obviously, you've had people like the sartorialist, you know, you've got all of the sort of blogs and websites and the sort of ability for so many people to become a commentator and a blogger and in a way very influential. I mean, you know, you talk about Vreeland, but actually there are some of the young bloggers now who have huge impact.
They are having an enormous impact, there's no doubt about that. And I've read a few, and frankly, they're just as perceptive as many of the people in the newspapers. I think fashion journalism in this country is at a low ebb at the moment. I do think that should not be reported. I think I'll be stoned next time I go to a fashion show. But no, no one was more cynical than I was of bloggers. I thought, well, what do they know, for God's sake? They're just kids. And then I met a guy called Billy Boy. Is he called Billy Boy? And I was very surprised. He knew a hell of a lot about fashion, more because he was an enthusiast, more than many a well-paid fashion journalist in this city, I can tell you. And I met Taffy, who was a very unnerving little girl, but again, very clever. I don't know what she's doing now. She seems to have gone off the radar. And of course, a lot of them, I'm sure, do that. But again, it's this business. If you have 50 people as long as one survives, then it was worth it as an enterprise. Yes, I really think that if I were a student, that's what I would want to be knowing about. Because in a way, it's rather silly. We go to college or university to learn about the thing we know instinctively we can do. Why go to an art college to learn to design clothes when it's what you wanted to do since you were 12? It's a bit of a no-brainer, I think. Much better would be to go to an art college and find out how you can use various things to make your approach better. But it is an interesting question, why we go to learn what we can do already. You know, maybe colleges, fashion colleges, should just do courses on ideas. Ideas, you know. As some in Japan, I think in particular, Japanese, not colleges necessarily, but groups, they just think of ideas. There used to be a thing called brainstorming. I don't know whether it still happens. I used to love it because I used to say the most outrageous things. And they couldn't get cross because they say at the beginning, anything goes. You can say whatever you like. This is a brainstorming session. And I used to have great fun. But it was a very interesting idea. And maybe we need more brainstorming.
I think that issue of analysis is really important at the moment, and really judging what it is that we're trying to do, both with fashion and our commentating about it as well. I think is.
And I think it's very hard.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very hard. What I find worrying is academics, who play a very important role, they seem to write books that they only expect other academics to read. You know, academic speaks unto academic, because I read books about fashion by academics, and I think this isn't what I've been in over 30 years of fashion. This isn't really touching what it's about. It can be very interesting as an exchange of ideas, but it's just that, an exchange of ideas. That's right.
Absolutely. No, I agree. There was a question, yes, up there.
How do you see the future of fashion prints? How and why will or will they not survive?
Fashion fringe was conceived.
Fashion prints.
Did you say fashion fringe?
Prints.
Prints as in
Fashion what?
Prints. Prints. Printed page.
Oh, the printed
editorial.
page. Well, I think that eventually it must go, but I doubt if it'll go completely in the lifetime of anybody in this room. I think that there's a marvellous sort of thing of feeling. I used to have a dog called Peggy, and she was an incredibly perceptive dog. She wouldn't look at American Vogue. She adored French Vogue because of the smell and the feel of it, you know? I want to see a magazine which can do what a film could do, but in your hand, you know? And that will probably go. I tell you what I think. It's virtually impossible. The future never exists until you're part of it. It is impossible to predict a future because we can only project what we are doing now. You know, and I think that certainly things are moving so quickly that in 10 years' time we'll have a future which people are trying to predict now but getting nowhere. It's like Paul Pierre Caron and Courage and all. They wanted to do futuristic work. Nothing looks more old-fashioned than Courage and people like that from the 60s and 70s. You can't do it. The future doesn't exist until you're there. But something new will happen, certainly. Yes, there was a guy.
I am a great admirer of your work, and so my question is, with the fullest respect, when are you going to write an autobiography?
Well, I have the title. I have the title, which I'm not going to tell you, and I have one or two of the more surprising things. I'm going to do it, actually. I'm going to do it. And I've got a very good editor lined up already who will not allow me to be pompous, because at my age, you do have a slight tendency to talk at or even talk down to people. And that is the kiss of death. But it'll be fun. It'll be funny. It'll be full of humour. We hope, with the wisdom of the ages sort of intertwined between it all. 2 years, 5 years, I don't know.
Yes.
Yes.
Being the founder of Fashion Week and having worked in Italian fashion houses, what do you
I didn't quite get it, but are you saying what is the position of emerging designers in Italy? No, I think that only England can suffer on that. Because quite simply, at the end of the day, the advertising, which keeps magazines going, comes from Milan. So no matter how tough we're being at the moment, sadly, if Milan is determined not to move, then we are in some sort of trouble. And there are always ways of getting around this trouble. And one of the best things is, they say, keep your the Italian expression, keep your enemies close to you. It might be the answer for our young designers to go and show in Milan. I don't know. But you must remember, Italian designers aren't young. They work in, their art schools aren't anywhere near as good as ours. So they work in the industry, and they become known, and then at a certain point they've worked with, I don't know, Cavalli or Prada or something for about 10 years, and somebody suddenly says, you're ready to go on your own. And then they're given the full works, the money and everything. They never are allowed to fail. There have been very, very, very few Italian designers who fail. But you don't get really young ones. We have people who are lauded as stars 2 months out of college. But I know with John Galliano it was the case, just like with David Hockney, it was the same. But it's a mistake to assume that it's going to be true of everybody. I have to say, I think that despite what Mr. Berlusconi is doing, the Italian fashion business is a very grounded one. And they've been criticised by Anna Wintour for being boring. They've been criticised for being too commercial, but they still sell.
And what about the sort of, China and Korea, all the South America? I mean, as you said, fashion is critical. It's so ubiquitous as part of our 21st century culture. And obviously, it's not just going to be about America, Northern America and the sort of, Europe. What about the emerging nations? Where do you feel some of the most interesting ideas? Because obviously you do, you travel a lot, yes. You look a lot, you're involved a lot.
Yes. Well, I want to say straight away, I think that Western culture is in decline. It will be a long decline. It might be 100 years, 200 years. It is in decline. It's slipping away, in my opinion. Nature abhors a vacuum. The vacuum will be taken up from the Far East, Asia, and I think China, India, a little later. China, which is of course going to own the whole of the West if it goes on lending money to countries. I think that there is a huge amount of creativity. I went to Seoul last year for Korean Fashion Week, and it's been going for 10 years. No one ever knows about it. Well, buyers go, but journalists don't. And I was amazed at how sophisticated it was. Very influenced by Japan, of course, because it's just next door. And I'm going to Hong Kong in a couple of weeks' time, and then on to China. And Roy Peach, he knows a great deal about this, and I think you would agree there's a vast amount of creativity, which is not going to take over. We're not all going to be wearing Japanese or Chinese national costume, but it will revitalize the dying light of the Western fashion. Yes.
Colin, do you
Yes.
think it is possible to have the working class hero as the designer anymore in the future with the increase of the fees? Do you think it could be another Galliano or another McQueen in London?
Well, that's a very, very, very good question, because it begs the question, which I said earlier about going to learn something you can already do. Can genius be taught? Certainly, I think that the whole structure, and I mustn't get into this now, but the whole structure of education is wrong. It's ridiculous that people have to pay £9,000. It's ridiculous that courses have to be swamped by people who do not understand the culture they're coming into, often don't wish to learn, don't even particularly wish to learn the language, And I think this is, unless people are very strong, It's going to pull down the whole level. I think there might be alternative ways of educating people, but certainly, I mean, my father wasn't poor, but he wouldn't have paid 9,000 for me. He would say, get out there, make your own way, you know? And people say, well, you know, the parents don't have to pay. It's just that eventually their child starts with an unbelievable debt. At my age, even, it would terrify me to have that sort of debt. You know? And they say, oh, well, you know, if you don't make enough money, then you won't pay it back. But then, what's the point of going to college if you're not going to be able to, you know, this is a subject that needs a symposium for a lot of people, yes.
I'm a second year journalism student, and obviously looking at graduation prospects and things like that for next year. With the emergence of things like the Devil Wears Prada in the September issue, fashion journalism is becoming more fashionable for people to do. Do
Yes.
you feel that that is influencing graduate prospects for people such as yourself who are on these specific courses?
I think that obviously in both cases they set out to say the fashion world, it's horrible, but isn't it marvellous? You know, it's so exciting and all the rest of it. And I think that I thought that The Devil Wears Prada was a very, very interesting film for a variety of reasons, as indeed the book was. Not necessarily good in either case, but interesting. I thought that the September issue was unbelievably boring. It had absolutely no narrative strength whatsoever. Those of us, and I'm not the only one in this room, who've known Anna Wintour for a long time, we know what she's like. She's painted as being the devil incarnate. She's not. She's just a woman who doesn't really enjoy small talk or chat or not being focused. She's demonized by everyone, but I would say this. She has made American Vogue and all, therefore, the other Vogues into a power that everybody knows about now, you know? And I'll tell you what I thought strange about September issue. I was amazed at how incredibly self-centered everybody was. Particularly, oh God, the one with red hair, what's her name?
Grace.
Grace, who I've always adored and loved to talk to and everything. I was really quite shocked, unless it was the way they cut it. She was only interested in her pages, her pictures of Galliano Couture. Now that isn't leadership. That's, well, we all know what it is. Indulgence, of course, indulgence, you know? I haven't seen the Valentino one, and I really would love to see that, because I'm told that that is honest, because they're being two old queens being a bit bitchy with each other and arguing and everything, you know, and apparently it's compulsive. I have not seen it, I don't know why, probably because I haven't got a television, so I can't, up in London, so I can't sort of do it. I think they've sat quite a long time, so, yes, right at the back.
We keep talking about the Queen of Galliano. I just wondered how you felt about precious fashion designers' effects, obviously in the wake of the tragedy of Lee and downfall of Galliano.
There is absolutely no way that anybody who isn't Alexander McQueen could possibly imagine the unbearable pressures that made him do what he did. It's just impossible to imagine. John, I think, is a more complex case because he seemed to step so totally out of character. By all we've read about Alexander McQueen, he did have, obviously, a dark side and a depressive side. And what happened presumably as a result of that. What happened with John is still a puzzle, and I don't know whether we'll ever know. But I was interested to see that John is now being represented by XIX, which is Fuller's.
Fuller's, yeah, Simon Fuller.
What's it called?
Simon, yeah.
Yeah, Simon Fuller's company.
PR.
You know, he's up there with I don't know, other stars. You know, Roland Murray's there. So that's rather interesting. So maybe he's going to be rescued and repositioned. You know. What I'm more interested in is what the hell is going to happen at Dior. They're taking a long time to decide. But I've heard that it's going to be announced before Christmas. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I don't know whether they'll do couture in January. If they want to bring in a new designer at this point, then he's going to have a pretty hard job on.
Colin, can I ask you, there's
Yes.
one designer, an English designer, that nobody talks about, and I think he's fantastic, and he's quite level-headed, and he's brilliant, I think. Hussein Chayam. Why is he not lauded in the same way as our other
Joan, I
designers?
agree entirely.
Did you see that exhibition?
Of course,
Wasn't it
yes.
fantastic?
I agree entirely. He's one of the ones who's shockingly...
It was why Hussein Chalayan
Hussein Chalayan,
isn't
sorry.
as lauded as well.
There was a very
Yeah.
good exhibition at the Design Museum, then there was a very much bigger one in Paris. And he's one of the designers who slipped through the net. And I don't know why, because he is one of our major creators. In fact, intellectually, he's probably ahead of all of the others, I think. He does bring an intellectual approach to it. And I think that's probably what frightens people. They don't know how to capitalize on intellectuality. People are frightened of intellectuals.
I think also you can't put him in a box. Whereas
He's very much in his own box. He's created his own world, you know. But no, something, perhaps a little less time, thought and money spent on young designers who are really not going anywhere with their flirty little dresses, and a little bit more time and money and everything actually looking at a person who could be, and is actually, a major figure.
Is he not recognised?
He's not recognised. No. Mind you, there's a lot of it is in a name. I think they should be called Fred Bloggs or Dave Smith, you know? I mean, well, it's true. When I first came back from Italy, I was amazed at how few people knew how to pronounce Versace. It was, most people said Versace. And then I thought, well, before I went to Italy, although my Latin probably would have helped me, but I might have said Versace, you know? And names are difficult. And if you're embarrassed about the name, you don't use the name. You know?
I think that's one of the reasons.
Well, there is a story, totally apocryphal, I'm sure, about Chanel. Virtually all the stories that are about Chanel are untrue. I'm quite sure of that. But apparently, Chanel No. 5 sold better in Paris during the war than any other perfume, because it was the only one that the GIs could pronounce. They could go into a shop, buying it for their girlfriend, their mistress, send home to their mum. They knew Chanel No. 5. Just as they, give me some of that No. 5, you know? And so, no one wants to be embarrassed. No one wants to be embarrassed in a shop by having a jumped up little assistant sniggering behind her hand because you don't know how to say Balenciaga. We all say it wrong. I used to know a marvellous woman who'd been a model for Balenciaga, and she married one of those Russian princes, when there were thousands of them. And she said, we were talking, and I was obviously irritating her. She said, and she made a great point, she said, yeah, and Balenciaga, as we call it, or Balenciaga, as you call it. You know, I thought, what a brilliant put down. You know? Because she'd been in Paris, of course. The French would say Balenciaga. Very interesting.
And one of the things, the last sort of question really, because we've got to
Yes, we must
let you go, was really you obviously interviewed everybody. Who was the most interesting person, most revealing person that you, from the industry that you'd interviewed?
The most interesting intellectually was undoubtedly Miuccia Prada. The ones who made my life very easy were Marc Jacobs and Tom Ford. You'd think they were playing rugby. You threw a question at them and they talked for about 15 minutes. It was so easy and engagingly and excitingly. They both were, well, Mark in particular was prepared to laugh at himself. The worst was Donna Karan.
Yeah.
She had flown in and there was something wrong with the cameras. She looked up and she saw herself and said, oh my God, get those cameras off me. And of course up there, they live in their own world up in that little box up there. So they didn't do that. And it was terrible. I didn't know what to do. This was early on in the interview. For the rest of the interview, she kept pulling her hair. Every time she talked, she kept pulling her hair forward. And I thought I was so embarrassed. I felt I'd let her down very badly. The most nervous was John. And a few years ago, 2 years ago, I asked John if when I brought him over for Fashion Fringe, I said, would you do another talk? He said, no, not even for you. He said, I still wake up in a cold sweat about it. He said, I will never, ever do that again. He said, I couldn't. He was shaking and sweating over stuff. Lee McQueen wasn't easy either. He was it's very interesting how so many English, we've got a marvellous education system, and yet so many English people are tongue-tied, whereas Americans, they've got a lovely expression, they call it running off at the mouth, and they do, you know. And you don't want to hear people, I mean, you've got to be at ease as well, you don't want to hear people saying, oh, well, I don't quite know how to put it, it's difficult, you know, you want them, even if they're talking rubbish, as long as they keep the flow going, you're not going to be embarrassed, right? Simple as that. Anyhow, I hope I haven't bored you. I hope I haven't embarrassed you.
No, you've been wonderful. You've been absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Colin. Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.